So basically, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on natural law theory because we went over the basics of it last time. Not last class. Unfortunately, last class we weren't able to really do anything because of my stupid computer. But again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on natural law theory, but I do want to spend maybe half the class, or hopefully a little bit less. I don't know, it depends on how long it takes us to talk about other ways in which ethics can intertwine with or intersect with religion. And I don't want to give you the wrong impression that in order to be a natural law theorist, you have to be religious. That's not the case, but, and I think I mentioned this last time when we talked about this, people who are natural law theorists tend to be religious. They tend to have a religious background or basis. And so I talked about Aquinas last class, and he was sort of the model that I used to explain natural law theory. And for him, you know, much like Aristotle, you know, we talked a bit about Aristotle as sort of the representative for virtue ethics. Sorry, I got a bunch of people in the waiting room, so I gotta let them join. So I'm that's why I'm pausing every once in a while. Okay, but anyways, so when we're talking about Aristotle, we were looking at his, you know, how his ethics fit into the bigger picture of things. You know, how what was his metaphysical view? In other words, what was Aristotle's view of the universe, and his political view, and how society sort of was organized, and this all tied into his ethics. Similar thing going on with Aquinas. In fact, Aquinas was greatly influenced by Aristotle. Most natural law theorists point to Aristotle as an influence. And I mentioned this before. It's controversial whether or not Aristotle himself was a straight natural law theorist when it comes to ethics. But Aquinas, you know, he's sort of the poster boy, the model for natural law theory. And natural law is much like Aristotle. You know, it fits into a hierarchy. It fits into a greater picture of the universe. So ultimately, God is the being from which all that is emanates. This is Aquinas. This is what Aquinas believes. So there's this being that is the perfect, infinite, absolute being from which all other being, all that is, emanates. And all of these laws, all of these ways in which the universe is and is organized emanate from this perfect being and are contained within God. So eternal law is the highest level of organization and understanding. Eternal law and divine law, these are actually separate things. Eternal law is something like beyond, it's beyond reason. It's it's beyond human understanding. You know, it's ways in which the universe is, in which in ways in which the universe is that human beings through our rational consciousness can never understand. We can never comprehend. God, you know, you can think of eternal law as the contents of God's mind, which would include, it includes all of the lower levels. They're all included and embedded within it, but it encompasses and goes beyond all of those. So it's beyond logic, beyond reason. It's, you know, incomprehensible to most human beings. Now, divine law, we're going to come back to, but basically there's a couple functions of divine law. It's separate and it's different from eternal law. Divine law, it basically guides humanity and basically fills the gaps. I hate to use that phrase because it's sort of slangy, but you know, it fills the gaps that are left due to the, I guess what you might call the imperfection of humanity. So when we get down to human laws, we talked about this last time. Human laws are, humans use our ability to reason and to understand the natural way to be, what's right, that's natural, sort of a natural sense. We use that and we apply it to more specific cases, and that's when we devise legal codes, speeding, traffic laws, and things like this. We apply general principles to pursue good, avoid evil, not to harm innocent people, don't kill innocents. These are more just intuitive, natural laws that all human beings have stamped in our soul, says Aquinas. God stamps this understanding. It's like a moral sense, and we apply it to human law. But human law, establishes legal courts and systems to punish evildoers, to punish criminals. But occasionally, obviously, because humans are not perfect, we're in an imperfect state, we are unable to punish every evildoer. And as Aquinas puts it, even if we had a perfect state and even if we had perfect courts, humans are only able to punish external sins, not internal sins. External movements, not internal movements. And so what he means by that is, we can only see what you're doing. We don't know what you're thinking. And if you're not even supposed to covet your neighbor, I don't even know. You might be coveting your neighbor your whole entire life, or your neighbor's wife. What is that? Don't covet your neighbor's wife. You could be coveting your neighbor's wife your whole life, but you're slick about it. You're cool. No one knows. They're like, what? You like her? I didn't know. You're pretty, but God will punish you for that covetousness, right? That's where divine law comes in, right? Divine law is supposed to fill in the gaps where humanity kind of fails. And also divine law comes in and it guides humans in other cases where God's eternal law seems to be at odds. It isn't really for Aquinas, it never is for real, but it seems to be at odds with human reason, right? There are some things like when God told Abraham, according to Christian tradition and Jewish tradition and Islamic tradition for that matter, when God told Abraham to sacrifice his son, and he went to go do it, that went against reason. Why would God want you to kill an innocent? That's against, his innocent child. Well, it was a part of a plan. He was testing Abraham, or however you interpret that theologically. There's no way you could justify it rationally, but it was a part of this grander scheme of things. So God sort of jumped in and sent one of his messengers or something like that. So this is the idea behind divine law. So again, eternal law is sort of like the ultimate universal contents of God's mind, all knowledge. Divine law is a separate thing. It guides humanity in circumstances when their own reason alone is not enough to do the right thing. They have to has to be revealed to them by God. In fact, sometimes what they have to do goes against what seems natural, occasional exceptions. And also God punishes the evildoers who get away with it in this life, right? So that's divine law. It fills the gaps where human law fails. And natural law, again, this is really the most important part for us, and we're going to review this a little bit more and then move on to some other stuff in just a moment. But natural law, again, they're intuitive for Aquinas, and for most natural law theorists, they're going to make this argument that there's just something about right and wrong, good and bad, that is intuitive. There's a moral sense that you have, that you just know whether or not something is right or wrong. You don't have to be taught it. And that's a pretty controversial claim. I'm curious, what some of you might think about that. But Aquinas is drawing from the biblical tradition. He says something like, and I think he's quoting Paul's, one of the letters from St. Paul, from the New Testament. He says that the law is written on the heart I think that's from Galatians, but I don't know for sure, so I don't want to. But it's definitely Paul who says that. Okay, so remember, Aquinas he's a Christian, so he's drawing from that tradition primarily. But what does he mean by that? And you don't have to be a Christian, I guess, to believe this. Okay, there's actually there is a somewhat famous, if you know anything about Eastern philosophy, or especially Confucian philosophy, he's fairly famous. Mencius is a pretty well-known Confucian philosopher, and he has a similar view. Mencius thinks that all human beings, we just know that something is wrong. We don't, even when we're a little child, as soon as we're sort of old enough to kind of understand who we are and what we are and where we are, we just already have this inner sense of justice. And so when we see somebody being treated unjustly, it rubs us the wrong way, even if it doesn't hurt us. We don't like it. If we're a kid watching a movie and we see a character who's the bad guy, we just know they're the bad guy because they're doing bad things, and it's just obvious. And so Mencius has a similar view. He argues for this as well. I'm curious. If you want, you can jump right in, but I'll open my chat box. It seems to be working today. I'm wondering, who thinks that this is correct? Are we born with a sort of inner sense of intuition of morality, like Mencius and Aquinas are arguing here? Is there a natural law written on our hearts? Maybe not about every little thing, but just general. We just know it's wrong to murder. Or is that something we have to be taught? What do you think? Is it innate? Are we born with it? Or do we have to be taught? I guess nobody has an opinion on this at all. So, yeah, go ahead.
I think that we just innately know it, because even if you're told that something is right, sometimes deep inside you know it's wrong, even though no one's ever stated that.
Right. Yeah, I'm on the fence about this. I kind of lean towards you, but I can see in the comments that we're a lot of other people are at odds with us. They're like, no, you're taught it. You're taught it. Now, Mencius he's not naive to think like, okay, you're just born and you're going to be a good person. And he says you do, he says you have what's called, he calls them sprouts as a metaphor. There's these sprouts of goodness within you, and they have to be cultivated. So if they're not cultivated, you could grow up to be a wicked person, but you have this seed of goodness in you. And the way you cultivate it for him, well, it's like a typical Confucian. You got to look up to role models, and you have to have good parenting, and you have to respect your parents, respect your elders, and you have duties to your society and to your boss and to your leader and your king and whoever, and do all those things. But also, and this is, I think, the inside of Mencius. This is sort of what's unique about him as a Confucian, is he thinks that one has to have experience with seeing other people and having sympathy, developing empathy and sympathy with other people. And so there's one story where he talks about a king who is sitting on the throne, and his servants are walking by him with a lamb, and the lamb is about to be slaughtered for the king to eat. But the lamb, I guess, kind of knows what's going on, and the lamb is visibly shaken and fearing and scared. And so the king sees the lamb and says, "What's wrong? What's going on? Why is the lamb scared?" It really bothered him, And they told him, "Well, we're going to go slaughter the lamb for your feast, for your meal tonight." And he said, "No, don't. Let the lamb live. Just go get a cow instead," right? And one of his advisors was talking to another one of his advisors, and they're sitting there. He's like, "Wait a minute, King. you're gonna like let the lamb live, but then you're gonna go kill the ox or the cow or whatever, and the other guys just stop, shut up, don't say anything. You know, he can't see the cow, and so that's why he can't sympathize with it. But he sympathizes with the lamb because he saw it. He saw its face. He felt the emotion or whatever the heck, you know, that intuitive draw towards that living being, and that's a good start. Eventually, he'll move on to caring about the cow, and he'll move on to caring about all the other animals, and then his whole kingdom and all his people and all this stuff. And so, you have to start with these examples, you know, very direct in your own life, and you develop sympathy with others. But I'm curious though, we've got a couple people in the chats who say no, it's taught, you learn it. If you've got anything to say, feel free to jump in. But
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I don't know much about it, but I feel like it's taught because when we're young or when we're infants, we don't know anything. We don't know what's right from wrong. And as we start to grow older, like when we're 4, 5, we start to like learn about what's right or wrong. Meaning, like if we do something that's not right or that's wrong, we get in trouble, but we learn from that. We're
Right.
taught like you can't do this because it's bad.
Right.
Or I don't know if you know the Menendez brothers case.
Yeah, they were a couple. They were didn't they murder a bunch of people or what? What
No,
was
they murdered their
their
parents
parents? Yeah, that's right. Okay, it's been a
because
while.
of how abusive
Yeah.
how abusive their father was, like
Right.
mentally, how they would abuse how he would abuse them mentally, physically, emotionally, and
Right.
emotionally. So I feel like because they were taught just like by their father, like just
Right. And
we
there's a
don't
lot of
like
cases like that. I forgot the name of this woman, but there was this one woman who, a young lady who was raised in a closet or something like that for the first like 19 years of her life and treated like an animal. And, you know, if you just look up feral humans or something, that's kind of a crude way to put it. But if you Google that, you'll probably find all sorts of stories like this. And, you know, to me, this brings up the whole nature nurture debate. Is anyone familiar with the nature nurture debate? Maybe you've taken a class in psychology and you went over this, you covered this.
no. But
Well,
that's why
it kind of goes to what you're saying. You seem to be arguing for nurture, whereas someone like Mencius and Aquinas seem to be arguing for nature, that you're born good, you're born with this innate, you know, capacity, and you just know what's right or wrong. It can be corrupted, it can be distorted, but you're born this way. But you're saying no, you're born neutral. Like you're born neutral, and your parents or how you're nurturing, how you're raised is what makes you who you are.
yeah, that's how I feel.
Well, I think that people are neither good nor bad.
Mhm.
It's about the decisions that are then made.
Right.
Like when you're born, I don't know if you're exactly a blank slate because of biology, but definitely, you know, if you were brought up by the right person, then maybe you could just be good,
Right.
even if you had like antisocial personality disorder or something.
Yeah. So you seem to be leaning more towards the nurture, at least when it comes to this sort of question of like morality and your sense of right or wrong and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to be with you guys, but I can see the intuitive appeal though of Mencius and Aquinas. There's the famous thought experiment of Mencius. He asks everyone to think about what they would do in a situation where they saw a small infant, you know, like a baby who was about to crawl into a deep well, like a chasm or something, and there was no one else around. You know, you see this baby, like what the hell is this baby doing here? And it's about to fall and be hurt. And Mencius says, well, like who would not save the baby? Like who wouldn't go grab the baby and prevent it from killing itself? Like, you know, who would not do that? I mean, everybody would save the baby. And why? Why would you do that? You wouldn't do it because you expected some reward. You know, someone mentioned a punishment. You know, you wouldn't do it because you were afraid someone would punish you for not saving it. You just do it because you just know it's right. It's an innocent child that doesn't know what it's the danger it's about to get itself into, and you just instinctively know it's the right thing to do. You know, but this is assuming you're a human being who knows what a baby is, and you've developed social skills, and I don't know. So the nurture debate, or the nurture side, might have, you know, might push back on this. There's a story that I heard on the radio years ago. I mean, it's probably over 10 years ago, but it was interesting because they were interviewing a neuroscientist, and he was looking at brain scans of these sociopaths, I think serial killers. They were like all these serial killers and murderers and, you know, psychopaths. And so he was studying their brain patterns, and he said that if you look at their brain patterns, there's a similarity, there's a defect. If you look, there's one area of the brain, he said, that is primarily responsible. Its function is to make moral judgments and to basically empathize. It's like this empathetic part of the brain that you know, he says the neuroscientists believe is used for ethical judgments. And if you look at all these brain scans, he says all these serial killers, all these sociopaths, all these psychopaths, that part of the brain is like dead. There's hardly any activity at all. It's just, it doesn't really function. It's just the dead zone. So he was very much like, it's just genetics, you know, you're born with, you know, you're psychopath or whatever, you know, and you can't control it. It's completely nature. It's, you know, and this is like the funny part of the story. He did a scan of his own brain, and he realized that he had the same defect, that that part of his brain was not really firing that much at all either. And so then he starts to say, well, maybe it's not 100% nurture, right? Like maybe, I think, I forgot who was it Alice that was saying, you know, maybe you're born with a certain genetic and biological DNA, but, you know, your parents, your upbringing, you could be taught. And so that was sort of his explanation. He was like, well, okay, I had really good parents, and I went to private school, and I had really good role models. And so, you know, maybe if I had been abused, maybe if I had had horrible parents, I would have become this horrible monster, you know. But luckily, I had a good environment. I was nurtured well. So I think anybody who probably takes exclusively nature or exclusively nurture, taking one side of the equation, to me, it seems like it's got to be a little bit of both, you know. And so it's hard for me to sort of decide. I would say that it's got to, you know, obviously, you know, you might be born with certain innate capacities. Maybe some people are born with a facility to learn language very quickly, and some are really good with quantitative thinking and can think about numbers very well. Others are very emotionally intelligent, and they can read other people's emotions, and they can empathize with other people very well. And so there are some capacities, I think, that can be learned and sharpened, and other, I don't know. I mean, it seems like it's a pretty complicated thing, and maybe it's different for different people. But you know, to get back to St. Aquinas and Mencius, you know, for them, it's, I don't want to put them completely on the nature part either, but they're going to say you have a natural tendency, you have a natural capacity to want to be a good person, to want to do good and want to do just things. And you kind of just know what that is. So just real quick, I want to move on because I feel like we spent hardly too much time on natural law theory, but real quick, let's review the definition that I gave for natural law theory, this sort of 3 bullet point definition. Right, a natural law theorist is going to see the universe, the world, as a natural, rational order. It operates according to laws of physics, biological laws, chemical laws, but also ethical laws. Those are all thrown in with mathematical laws, logical laws of reasoning. All that's a part of natural law. It's all kind of synonymous with Aquinas. Although for him, the most important part of the natural law is the ethical, because that concerns our highest aim, which for him is not necessarily happiness. Remember, for Aristotle, our highest aim is eudaimonia, self-fulfillment, complete sort of happiness. For Aquinas, that is our temporal, earthly aim, but we have a higher aim of blessedness. And because God, the creator of this world order for Aquinas, gave us this inner natural capacity to reason and understand all these laws of nature. He did it with this very specific purpose in mind, so we can achieve blessedness. So the moral function of reason for Aquinas is the most important. It trumps all the other uses of reason, whether you're using reason to do math, to understand physics and science and astronomy and all this other stuff. That's important, but reason's most important function is in practice and applied to action and to doing things. And so it's a good thing we have it. We're able to understand the laws of the universe, but we're also able to act on them. We're also able to utilize them, as I have it here. And so the natural law tells us what's right and wrong, and we can determine what's right or wrong based on what's natural versus what's unnatural. Last time we had the lecture on natural law theory, we went over some of the problems of this, so I don't want to dwell on them too much today, but one of the issues is, well, how do you determine what's natural versus what's unnatural? Is it natural for me to wear a t-shirt and wear clothing? Would it be more natural for me to just walk around with my willy hanging out? Why aren't we all nudists, and but because we have reason, and reason tells us that clothes protect our body from harsh weather and from temptations of other people's jiggly bits. So as rational beings, we don't want to have sex for fun. We just want to have sex to procreate. So can't be walking around naked. And so this is where it gets a little squirrely. This is where it gets a little bit of gray area. We had a pretty decent discussion last time. So again, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I made the argument that maybe putting someone on life support, like the Terry Schiavo case, that seemed unnatural. But then there's other people who say, no, it is natural. God allowed us to create the life support machine using reason. And if God wanted her to die, he would have let her die before. And so this is an issue that's tough to settle. I mean, I think that what Aquinas would ultimately say is, you guys are splitting hairs, and come on, it's obvious what's natural. But it's easier for him to say because he was living in the 1300s. And, today, I think the divide between nature and, artificial is becoming more and more blurry. But so that's one problem. Another one, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, is the famous naturalistic fallacy. This is also referred to by many as the is-ought fallacy. That's how David Hume refers to it. It's basically the idea that you can't derive an ought, a moral ought, a moral imperative. You can't derive what ought to be from what is. So when you're describing nature, if you're a biologist or a chemist or a physicist, your job is to simply describe the world and to explain it. Here's the way the world is, here's how it works. But the idea is that with modern science, you're not making any judgments. You're not saying it's good that it's that way, that it's supposed to be that way. Any ought, any should, is something completely different from what is. Those are different, just logically different judgments. So deriving what ought to be from what simply is a logical fallacy, says Hume. And up until very recently, This naturalistic fallacy has been pretty much accepted widely by most philosophers. I don't know if we want to get too much into it, but there's a few non-religious, even secular philosophers who attack this and actually think you can derive an ought from an is. But traditionally, people think that no, they're different, distinct concepts, and so it's a very it's a very big leap in logic. It's a logical leap. It's a fallacy. It's bad reasoning to try to derive a normative moral imperative, a should statement, from a descriptive statement, an is statement, something about the way things are. Right? Again, the way I stated here, you can't derive what should be the case from what merely is the case. Now, and again, before I move on from this, to be fair to Aquinas, and I don't know if this is really being that fair, because this also requires a leap in logic. He believes in God, remember? So he's a Christian. He's, you know, what you call Catholic today, you know, Roman Catholic theologian. And so for him, I don't know if this is that much of a leap. The problem for him, though, is he's got to prove that God exists somehow, using reason. And he thinks he can, you know. Since this is not a class in theology or metaphysics, I don't want to dwell on all of Aquinas' arguments for God. So, but that's one thing you have to keep in mind, that maybe, you know, if he can prove that there is a God, and that God's good and perfect and all these other things, and that God created the world a certain way because it's good, then the naturalistic fallacy isn't as much, I think, of a leap in logic. If you assume that God's good and created everything that is, then he must have created it the best way he could have. But David Hume is looking at this from a purely secular, you know, let's detach any sort of religious belief and just look at what are the statements saying. Natural law theory is saying if it's natural, that's the same thing as being morally good. So that tree is good because it just is natural? What if the tree like grows into the side of the house and screws up the structure? That's good because it naturally did that? These are two completely different judgments. And so by and large, the naturalistic fallacy is widely accepted by most philosophers. And that's why natural law theory still is, it's not one of the most popular theories that we're going to look at this semester. We talked about the doctrine of double effect last time. I'm not going to go over that. I was going to briefly cover some different approaches to ethics from religious standpoints. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, it's way beyond the scope of this class to do justice to all these different traditions. And so what I'm going to say, you know, it's going to be very brief and overly simplistic, but I'm going to say just a few things about how, you know, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Christians, Muslims, how they might approach ethics or ethical issues. And again, this is going to be overly simplistic. All these traditions are pretty complex, and there are many different followers who follow them in different ways. And so, you know, keep that in mind as I go through these. Before I do that, though, let me very briefly, I'm going to make a list. So, you know, before we get to all these different religions, let's make a list of some normative ethical theories. So what I mean by normative, these are just general theories of ethics. They establish norms, okay? And so what are some of these general theories of ethics that we've looked at? Do that real quick. Well, so far, we've looked at virtue ethics, right? That's Aristotle. Today, we're wrapping up natural law theory, okay? And Aquinas is sort of the guy that is the model for us in this class. And then if we have time, we might get started at the very end of class. We might get started on contractarianism. or social contract theory. Okay. And the last two, so we're gonna go over the five major ones. The last two would be Kantian ethics, sometimes referred to as deontological ethics. Don't worry too much about the terminology. We're gonna go over this again next week. And then last but not least, utilitarianism. So these are the basic, I guess, what you might call secular ethical theories, non-religious. I mean, Kant was a religious man. Mill was a religious man. At least they said they were. But they tried to base their moral theories on just philosophical arguments, and so they're secular in that sense. So these are the major theories that we're going to look at before we kind of move on to the primary sources in the course material, before we get to the first real major essay that we're going to look at in the second unit, which is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. But since we're going to cover contractarianism, Kantian ethics, and utilitarianism, we're going to cover those in detail pretty quick here. Like, in fact, maybe by the end of class today, we'll get to this third one. I'm not really going to say anything about them, but let's move on to these different ethical approaches, different religious approaches to ethics from the major world traditions. And, since I mentioned Confucianism earlier, it's debatable whether or not Confucianism is a religion. There's a Neo-Confucianism, which certainly has some religious elements. That's definitely a religious Confucianism, but it's not very widely practiced today. I would say, though, between like Confucianism and Hinduism, there's a lot of similarities as far as like how a typical modern day Hindu or Confucian, I don't know if there really are many Confucians left anymore. There are people who are very influenced culturally by Confucian philosophy. If you go to China, obviously Chinese culture is widely influenced by the Cultural Revolution of Chairman Mao. So that's very modern, post 1950s. But they have deep roots in Confucian philosophy and even a little bit of Buddhist philosophy. But if you look at modern Hindus, modern Confucians, in Hinduism you have what's called the caste system, and there's something a bit similar in Confucian philosophy. Does anybody know what a caste system is? Are anyone familiar with the term, the caste system in Hindu? What's a caste?
It's like some people, you're born into your situation, basically.
Yeah, and it's sort of what we might call a class, like a social or economic class in society, and some Hindus will argue against what you just said, but I think you're correct. In practice, you're born into it. A lot of Westerners criticize the caste system because, especially in America, we have this idea, whether or not it's true, but we have this idea of upward mobility, that you should be able to, like, through hard work and perseverance, even if you're born poor, if you're smart and you work hard and you do good and you're innovative, that you can rise to be rich or something. And so we don't like this idea that, you're born into it and you have to stay there, right? But some Hindus defend it. Well, it used to be not hereditary. It used to be that, like, people are naturally gifted at certain things, like they're a builder, so that they do the building, and they're more of a wise religious person, so they're a priest, but now, like you said, you're kind of born into it. But how does this sort of work in practice? Modern Hindus, a lot of them, they see themselves, and again, I don't want to speak for them all because it's a huge religion, and it's very old, one of the most ancient traditions. But if you meet Hindus in the United States and in more modern cities, their religious practice, the way it informs their life, is it's kind of secular, because like Confucianism, very secular philosophy. There are these sort of proper roles, proper social roles, and relationships. A relation between a father and a son, between a brother and a younger brother, between a boss and their employee, between master servant, king and subject. And there must be respect going both ways. So there are certain duties that you have. And so in Hinduism, there's this famous story in one of their texts, the Bhagavad Gita, where this warrior Arjuna is looking across the battlefield, and he has to go fight uh, all these men who he respects, because it's a civil war and the kingdom has been divided. And he looks at the other side of the battlefield. He says, well, I can't fight because I respect the men on the other side. They used to be my friends. I don't want to fight this war. And Krishna, this deity, comes down to him and says, you must fight, Arjuna, because you're a warrior. I know that you love these men, you respect them, but you're actually doing them a favor if you kill them, because they're actually warriors too, and they have a duty to fight. And so if you die fulfilling your duty as a warrior, that's the caste, that's the class that you were born into. You were born into the warrior clan. If you fulfill that duty, Arjuna, you will be reborn on a higher plane of existence. And so the idea is that you don't move up your caste system in this life, you move up the caste system through reincarnation, through successive lives. This is the Hindu approach. And so you have to be if you're born into a servant class, be a good, dutiful servant, be respectful and honorable to your superiors. If you're a good king, or if you're a leader or whatever, you have to lead your people with respect and dignity. You have to treat them well and fairly and with justice, and don't exploit them and all this. And so it's the secular and the religious are very intertwined, you could say, in modern Hinduism. So being a good citizen, doing a good job, but again, also kind of staying in your place. Very controversial, very controversial. And again, I'm sure there are some modern Hindus who don't see it this way. There's Krishna consciousness and things like this, but I'm talking about your average, Hindu who's gonna, might live in a city here in America, or might live in a major city over in India, and their worship is, it's basically Bhakti Devotion or Bhakti Yoga. That's the word that's used for devotion, is Bhakti. But basically, the idea is that Bhakti is sort of, you go to temple every week or maybe a few times a week. And if there's anyone here who's Catholic, maybe you might be familiar with this. This might sound like a similar notion to the notion of a patron saint in Catholicism. But you'll have a sort of deva or deity that is supposed to be sort of your chosen deity. And so you go and you worship God as a whole, but you worship God through that personification of one of his servants. So, you might go and worship Krishna or Lakshmi or Shiva or whoever it is who's your patron deva, and you'll look at those qualities of beauty as inspiration. And in a way, I find this a little similar to Aristotle. In fact, you could say there's a lot of parallels between Aristotle, Confucianism, and this part of Hinduism, that you got to have role models that you look up to. Of course, in Aristotle, they're not mythical. They're not mythical beings. They're not otherworldly beings. He's talking about actual role models. Same thing for Confucius. You have to have a good father figure, good mother, good parenting, good society, a good ruler. But in Hinduism, there are these sort of mythical, mythical not in a derogatory sense. There's stories about these otherworldly beings that are supposed to inspire you to good and just action. So Buddhism, again, I have to make this disclaimer over and over again. Buddhism, there's many forms of Buddhism. Buddhism has developed in many different parts of the world. It started in India and it spread all the way to Japan, and now eventually, you know, there's Buddhists in the United States and all over the world. So it's changed quite a bit, but some of the main tenets of Buddhism, you know, is that, you know, for one, this sounds so negative. One of the noble truths is that life is suffering. And what that really, again, and I say this sounds negative, but maybe it's not. What it really means to say that life is suffering, it's not that everything sucks. That sounds so negative, right? Life isn't always suffering. The word that is translated as suffering is dukkha, and it's probably better to think of it as unsatisfactory or ultimately fleeting or something like that. So life is always going to let you down, kind of thing, right? It's never going to be stable. It's never going to be at a point where things are going to be great and perfect and it's all going to work out. It's just part of life, right? To suffer, even when you're having your most magnificent moment and you're experiencing the greatest pleasures, well, that's going to end. And because it ends, it brings you much sorrow because you're going to miss out on that. And so the Buddha, right, the original Buddha, the man who achieved enlightenment and was able to spread the teachings of Buddhism, the way out of this for him is to detach yourself, because that the reason that you are suffering is because you are attached, and you are attached to things that are impermanent. You're attached to um, other people. You're attached to material gain. You're attached to your own sense of self and your own ego. And so you have to let go of all that. And the reason that you're attached is because of ignorance. And so the wisdom of the Buddha should be able to alleviate that ignorance. And then through that, you will be able to cease suffering. Okay. And then you won't have all that. You won't be attached anymore. And so I'm not going to go through the whole prescription, but if you want to look up the Eightfold Path, I guess I could write it down here, right? He says, you know, basically the way out of the suffering is what he calls the Eightfold Path. So there are 8 things that you need to do that will ensure that you are on the straight and narrow and you're living a good life, the middle way, as he calls it, not too strict, but not too indulgent, just right in the middle. If you're too strict, then you're going to be too tempted by things, and that's too much. But if you're too indulgent, then that's bad too. You'll be too attached to things. And so you got to find this middle way. And the Eightfold Path, I mean, he mentions things like you have to have the right livelihood. So what you do for a living, you can't make money off of other people's suffering. You can't, you know, have a job where you slaughter animals for a living, you know, to feed other people. Even if it feeds others, you're hurting and harming other living beings. You don't want to say anything to hurt other people's feelings. So you have to have the right speech. You have to have the right thoughts. You don't want to think ill and wrong about people. You want to have a clear conscience, and so don't do all these things. And so again, I'm not going to go over the whole Eightfold Path, but it's this sort of balanced way and trying to alleviate harm and alleviate suffering for as many people as you can, including yourself. And the way you alleviate suffering for yourself is to try not to be attached to too many things. Okay, so I think I've said enough about Buddhism, and we're getting close to the end of class, so I better move on. Confucianism, again, I don't want to say too much about it. It's not that there's a lot of practicing Confucians. In fact, for the longest time, the Chinese government seemed to want to deny that Confucianism had any impact on their culture whatsoever. It seems like China has become a little bit more positive about their relationship with their Confucian roots. I know there's I can't remember the name of it, but there's a Confucian Society or the Confucian Center or something like that. It's actually controversial. A lot of right wingers think that it's this way that the Chinese government's going to try to brainwash our children. But apparently, there's a program that's in all of our schools that's trying to promote literacy in Chinese culture, just to, to teach people about China or whatever. So it seems like they're not as in denial about how much Confucius influenced their culture. But again, it's not something like I'm a Confucian. You don't hear people say that. It's not like I'm a practicing Confucian. And to call a religion is maybe a stretch. But because it has such an impact on culture, maybe it's worth mentioning here. I would say that there's not a lot of difference between Confucian approaches to ethics than virtue ethics. It's basically another form of virtue ethics with maybe a little overlap with the Hindu caste system. There's a hierarchy in place. You're born into that hierarchy. You got to kind of stay in your place and be good at what you do, and that's your reward, is to be a good whatever it is you're born into, king or servant, whatever you happen to be born into. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Right? Okay. Now we're getting into even more controversial territory, because I want to say that there's even more splits within Judaism and Christianity, especially, than there are within Hinduism and Buddhism. They've branched off into so many branches. So I'm going to try to keep my comments very minimal here. I just give you sort of a very general. I'm going to try to say something that any person who's Jewish who practices Judaism, whether they're Orthodox or conservative, or they would all agree. But basically, so the Jewish people, at least as a practicing Jew today, it seems to be like one of the main focuses of their practice is being Jewish, right? Is respecting their traditions, their laws that have been passed down from Moses, the Mosaic laws. And so we're going to talk about divine command theory here. Probably, I don't know if we're going to have time for it today. I'm spending so much time on religion. We might have to leave this, the divine command theory, for next time. But basically, Judaism, you've got some sort of form of divine command theory. You've got this deity, this God, who guides the Jewish people and who sends these people proclamations. Now, after the prophets are done, that there's no more law. It's sort of set in stone. And so modern Judaism, what you might call rabbinic Judaism, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, modern Judaism is focused on interpreting those laws, understanding those laws as they were passed down through tradition. So that's why I said, being, the morals of Judaism are being a Jew, right? Being Jewish, and what does that mean? Following the traditions, right? Respecting the traditions of Moses. And a lot of these have to do with, being a good citizen, no matter where you're at. And ultimately, and this is where it gets a little bit more controversial, so you might put an asterisk on this part. The idea is that ultimately the Jewish people will create a state that is the perfect state, that is perfectly governed. Eventually, some Davidic king, a descendant of King David, will rise up and become this great ruler, and he will bring peace to earth. There'll be a great, tribulations and wars, and the Jewish people have to suffer, all sorts of, when they don't follow the rules, when they don't follow the Mosaic laws, then God punishes them and exiles them from the kingdom, and so they have to find their way back to the kingdom, and this is through interpreting and following their Mosaic codes. But again, eventually, as dutiful citizens of wherever they're at, even when they're subjugated, the Jewish people have to be good citizens, understand the laws that they're under, and be model citizens, and then eventually they'll found this perfect state that the world will see as a model, right? And there'll be peace on earth, basically, right? Is the idea. Now, Christianity obviously borrows a lot from the Jewish tradition. You know, you could even argue that Christianity is a form of Judaism, right? It's a you know, the Jewish people might not like that, but in a way, right, its roots are there. The idea that you know, Christ is understood, Jesus is understood as this descendant of David who comes, but instead of him basically instituting an actual kingdom, like a physical kingdom of with rulers and, you know, armies and stuff like that, he opens up this this promise of peace and well, I guess eternal life also, to everybody, right? And he says it's not just the chosen people, the Hebrews, but it's also all the Gentiles, everybody. And what they must do, though, and this is where I think Christianity is distinct from Judaism. The focus is more not on following laws and following codes, but more on forgiveness. And it becomes more, to me, it seems like, and again, this is something that's debatable. It depends on what, you know, your form of Christianity, but it seems like it's much more internalized. You know, in the Acts of the Apostles, I think there's a story of how Jesus was chastised because his disciples didn't properly clean themselves before they ate. And Jesus said, it's not what goes in their mouths that makes them unholy. It's what comes out of their mouth. And so I think it's like, you know, what comes out of their mouth is what comes from their soul. They speak their soul. And so they have a good soul. What they say will be good. But so again, there's different ways of interpreting that passage, but one way is it's not following the kosher laws and eating the right food at the right time, and you can't heal on the Sabbath. It's the intention. It's the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. And so there's this focus on forgiveness, you could say, in Christianity, that one must forgive. One must be open to turning the other cheek is the idea. You know, if one is, you know, hit on the head, you must turn the other cheek. On the other hand, though, there's this very redemptive quality, or this notion of redemption in Christianity that is sometimes overlooked, but sometimes emphasized in different branches. But the idea that Jesus, after he is sacrificed in order to forgive humanity and provide them salvation, if they are able to do the same and forgive all others and repent and ask for forgiveness themselves, after he does all this, after he comes to earth, there's the belief that they'll one day, Jesus is going to return and cast final judgment on all the people who are evil and bad, and he's going to raise up all those who are good. You know, punish the wrongdoers. Now, once Christianity becomes a little bit older, you know, to second, third, fourth century, the emphasis starts to turn onto the afterlife. You know, now there's this focus on, well, there's hell, and, you know, even if Jesus doesn't come back in your life, when you die, you're going to be punished. So there's this notion of, you know, you need to be a good person because you want forgiveness, and you know, if you want to be forgiven, you have to repent and you have to accept Jesus into your life. And if you do this, so again, how people practice their Christianity, that varies from culture to culture, from place to place, from denomination to denomination. Some focus a lot on charity, some focus a lot on community outreach, things like that. Others get more political. Some stay out of politics and they say that's how you're supposed to do things. So I don't know what else I'd want to add to that, but yeah, did you want to say something? I was just about to say, if anybody else wanted to maybe add
Yeah, for the
yeah.
Christianity one,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a Christian, but like, I don't think that like the after, like, you know, when we die, I don't think God wants to punish us, but like he's judging us. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's not that we're going to be punished because, like, if we do live a good life, well, this is what Christianity is. If we do live a good life, serving him and accepting him as our Lord and Savior, like, we're not going to be punished. We're going to be rewarded with.
Right, but if you don't, you go to hell and you're punished eternally. So if you
Yeah,
don't, yeah, if you're a sinner and you don't repent,
yeah, I guess.
yeah. Unless you're like an Anglican, like your Church of England, that they don't believe in hell, right? But that's pretty rare. Most Christians that I know believe in hell. You
Mhm.
know, but you're right. Some don't. Some don't believe in hell. They, you know, I mean, and even Muslims, they seem to think that it's not permanent though. They don't think that. They think, well, Allah punishes you, but he'll eventually, like after you get like punished for what you deserve, he'll eventually forget. Well, unless you're a non-believer. Like if you don't believe, if you're atheist or agnostic or whatever, that's something he'll never forgive you for. But like you'll be in hell forever. But like yeah, in Islam, it's like yeah, they're kind of like the Church of England, because it's sort of like Church of England denies there's a hell. Islam says, well, there is one, but it's kind of like it's almost like the Catholic purgatory. It's, you know, you go through it, you're punished, you get what you deserve, justice is met. So if you're a bad person, you get what you deserve, but eventually Allah, you know, Allah will forgive you. Um, Really briefly though, we're almost out of time. I got 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep it brief with Islam. And there's a few more things I want to talk about in regards to religion and ethics. And so if there's any other comments, but Islam, it also draws from the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? So they trace back their history to Abraham. They see Abraham as the first patriarch. And so they believe that you know, for them, Muhammad is the greatest prophet of all. And so for them, Jesus was not a Messiah. Jesus was not God. He was not the, you know, he wasn't the son of God in the sense that Christians believe. He was just a prophet. He was just another prophet. You know, they believed Adam was a prophet, Moses, Abraham. You know, some of the Hebrew prophets were you know, they acknowledged Jeremiah, I think they acknowledged, and so Jonah and some of these. And so for them, Muhammad was sort of the last. You know, they believe that the books that the Jewish people have and the books that the Christians have were originally correct. They were originally good, but they somehow got corrupted through history. People added things and changed them for political reasons. And so the Muslims believe that Muhammad came, or sorry, the archangel Gabriel, I think, came and gave Muhammad the Quran, which is the final last version of the story. And so it's the official word of God. And so really there as far as ethics are concerned, there's not a lot of difference between the ethics that you're going to find in the Old Testament of the Bible and the Christian, you know, the Christian New Testament. I mean, there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of overlap between Islam and Judaism. The thing with Islam is you've got 5 pillars, right? The 5 pillars of Islam. And geez, I now I have to remember them on the top of my head. Let me see. The one that's kind of like the most unique is the Hajj. I'll write the word Hajj up here. But so the Hajj, you're supposed to take a trip to Mecca. So Mecca is the most holy place. I don't even know if I spell the Hajj right. I think it's 2 A's and a J. If there's any Muslims here, please help me. I think that's it, but it's the Hajj is how that's pronounced. So you're supposed to it's a religious pilgrimage, okay? For our purposes, it's not that important to talk about the Hajj. You can look it up and read it. It's a pilgrimage. It's, you know, to commemorate this event in Muhammad's life, to show respect and to sort of submit to Allah in the way that he did at this holy site. So it's devotional. But the other 5 pillars, I think, are instructive for us since we're taking a class in ethics. Fasting, right? So you have to fast. You have to give charity. You have to pray. And you have to, how do I put this? It's the shahada. It's you have to proclaim faith, basically, right? You have to basically proclaim that you believe that there is no God but God, right? There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. You have to say it and believe it, and you have to, if people ask you about it, you have to explain what that means. You have to be very friendly to them. They don't want you to proselytize. You know, Christianity this is what makes it, I think, unique amongst those three. They're all based on very similar traditions and stories, similar myths, narratives, whatever you want to call it. But with Christianity, they proselytize mostly. They're all about converting. You have to go out and spread the gospel, spread the good word, tell as many people as possible, and try to convert them. You have to save them. Whereas Islam, they don't want you to do that. You don't want to push the faith on others. But if they ask, you must explain. The idea is that Allah will show them the light, and they will come to the faith, and that's their job. You don't want to proselytize, but you want to fast. The reason that you fast is that so you can understand what it's like to be hungry, and that you can sympathize with the poor. It's almost like Mincy is saying you got to sympathize and see people, and you have to develop empathy. So fasting helps you empathize with people who are less fortunate than you, and you have to give charity and help them out, right? Help out others. You must pray, show your devotion 5 times a day, facing Mecca, and then, as I said, you have to proclaim your faith. So these are basic values of Islam, right? Again, this way beyond the scope of this class to get really in depth on any of these. So unfortunately, I got to leave it there. But we're already out of time. It's freaking 11:16, so I'm going a minute over already. Let's see here. I'm looking at the chat box. Okay, I've already responded to all the comments. If you got here a little late, stick around. I'm going to stop recording now. We can talk about religion a little bit more next time. But for next class, we're going to move on to contractarianism, and that probably won't take that long. We might even have a chance to move on to Kantian ethics next meeting on Monday. So I'm stopping the recording right now.